I haven't got food. So why do I need to know that information? I'm trying to talk with you guys.
Some people might not mind doing it, and some people do. So, the story in the BBC News.
It did not begin with alarms. That IT did not begin with sirens, smashed windows, or crowds running. It began with doors closing quietly. Across some of Britain's busiest shopping streets, retail staff lowered shutters without announcement. Customers were guided out calmly. No urgency, no confrontation. Shelves remained stocked. Lights stayed on. By the time the pattern became visible, 23 stores were already empty. Not looted, not damaged, simply abandoned midday. That detail matters, because businesses do not evacuate functioning stores during peak hours unless something has shifted beneath the surface. This was not a late-night precaution. This was not a reaction to unrest already underway. It happened in full daylight, during normal trading hours, while foot traffic was still moving through city centers. Parents were shopping. Workers were on lunch breaks. Tourists were still inside stores when instructions came down to leave. And those instructions came fast. Staff across multiple locations reported receiving near-identical guidance within a narrow time window. Leave immediately. Do not escalate. Do not explain beyond what is necessary. Lock up. Move away. No coordinated public announcement followed. No emergency broadcast. No single incident to anchor the story. And yet the response was synchronized enough to raise an uncomfortable question. What do businesses know before the public does? Early confirmation showed the closures were geographically spread, not clustered around one flashpoint. That alone rules out several obvious explanations. This was not a response to a nearby disturbance. It was not crowd spillover. It was not reactive crowd control. When decisions like this occur across multiple districts at once, they reflect either shared intelligence, shared assessment, or shared fear. Retail chains operate on razor-thin margins. Closing early costs money. Emptying stores costs more. Doing so without visible cause carries reputational risk. These are not decisions made lightly, and they are rarely made in isolation. That is why the silence surrounding the closures proved more unsettling than the closures themselves. On the streets, the effect was immediate but muted. Shoppers adjusted routes without asking why. Foot traffic thinned in waves. Cafes nearby saw orders drop. Public movement slowed, not because anyone told people to stop, but because people sensed the shift and recalibrated. That behavioral change is critical. When people modify routines before instructions are issued, it signals that confidence has already begun to erode. Authorities initially described the situation as fluid and under review. That phrase appeared in briefings, short statements, and internal guidance. It sounds neutral. It sounds procedural. But translated into plain terms, it means this: control was being reassessed in real time. This was not damage control. It was preemptive retreat.
この時間は速報ニュースから。数分前、ウェストミンスターのパーラメントスクエアで行われたパレスチナアクション支持の抗議活動に警察が介入し、逮捕者が出ました。同団体はわずか数時間前に禁止され、正式にテロ組織に指定され。
As the hours passed, the ripple effects widened. Transport routes near affected areas slowed or diverted, not due to mechanical failure, but redeployment. Officers were pulled from routine duties and placed on standby elsewhere. Visible presence increased in some zones, while thinning noticeably in others. That unevenness created pressure. Areas with heightened visibility felt constrained. Areas without it felt exposed. Residents did not need confirmation to sense the imbalance. Movement changed again. People left city centers earlier than planned. Appointments were postponed. Non-essential travel quietly dropped off. This was not panic. It was adjustment. By mid-morning, the story crossed a threshold. The concern reached Westminster, not as a single emergency, but as an accumulation of signals. Security perimeters around government buildings tightened. Barriers appeared where none had been earlier. Access routes narrowed. The changes were subtle enough to avoid headlines, but visible enough to be noticed by those moving through the area. The message was understated but unmistakable. What began as a retail disruption was now being treated as a governance issue. Officials stressed that the situation was contained. But containment does not mean resolution. Containment means pressure has been boxed in, not removed. And pressure contained still exerts force. What made this moment especially unsettling was the absence of a clear trigger. There was no major incident to point to, no single crime, no defining spark. Instead, the closures appeared to be a response to accumulated strain, rising costs, long-standing public frustration, heightened enforcement systems, and a growing sense that daily life is being managed more tightly with less margin for error. When systems operate close to their limits, they do not need a shock. They only need time. As information circulated, official updates arrived slowly and carefully worded. Meanwhile, the public had already adapted. Routes were altered. Plans changed. Decisions were made without waiting for explanation. That gap between lived adjustment and official clarification is where uncertainty grows. The most consequential movements were not captured on camera. They were private decisions. The decision to avoid a street. The decision to leave early. The decision to disengage quietly. These choices rarely trend online, but they shape outcomes far more reliably than dramatic events. What this episode revealed was not disorder, but withdrawal. Withdrawal of commercial activity. Withdrawal of movement. Withdrawal of confidence.
Right side of the stage, please.
Empty shops are not merely an economic signal. They are a behavioral one. They show how quickly participation can recede when trust thins. And once participation recedes, restoring it becomes more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. By the time the doors were fully closed and the streets hollowed out, the immediate disruption was already over. But the signal it sent had only begun to travel. That signal reached Westminster because it needed to. Because when normal life pauses without explanation, it stops being a local issue. It becomes a national one. This was the moment before the narrative hardened, before explanations were framed, before stability was emphasized, before the system moved into its next phase. What followed mattered more than the closures themselves. Because once the doors came down quietly and people adjusted without being told, the question was no longer what happened. The question was what comes next. What followed the closures made clear this was no isolated commercial decision. The response pattern shifted from business discretion to institutional coordination. Once retail activity contracted across multiple districts, the state's posture changed with it. The first visible adjustment came through transport management. Several bus routes running through affected corridors were slowed or quietly rerouted. This was not announced as disruption. No technical fault was cited. Instead, services were described as operating under review. In practice, this reduced crowd density in specific zones while preserving normality elsewhere. The effect was subtle but deliberate. Policing strategy changed next. Officers were redeployed from routine patrols into standby configurations. Presence increased around symbolic and administrative sites, while thinning in commercial areas already contracting. This redistribution mattered. It reflected prioritization rather than escalation. The state was not responding to damage. It was repositioning in anticipation. At this stage, officials avoided direct reference to protests in public-facing statements. Language remained procedural. The situation was framed as fluid, dynamic, and under assessment. These terms are standard in early-stage risk management, but their repetition signaled uncertainty rather than control. Decisions were being made incrementally based on partial information rather than from a single command directive.
We'll keep going in a minute, but there are students as well. Could you head over to the right side of the stage?
Behind the scenes, The context was already understood. Palestine-related protests had intensified in recent days, particularly in city centers with high retail density and symbolic visibility. Demonstrations remained largely peaceful, but turnout was increasing, routes were shifting, and coordination was becoming harder to predict. From a risk perspective, this combination presents a different challenge than static protests. It complicates crowd modeling, staffing projections, and containment planning. Retailers responded to this shift before formal restrictions were imposed. That sequence is important. No closure orders were issued. No blanket advisories were released. Instead, private actors acted on shared signals, internal security briefings, local intelligence, and real-time assessments of crowd momentum. This produced coordinated outcomes without central instruction. When private precaution precedes public directive, it exposes a gap. The public experiences contraction without explanation, while institutions operate within frameworks that discourage early disclosure. That gap widened as the morning progressed. By late morning, security perimeters around Westminster were adjusted. Access points were reduced. Barriers were repositioned. Vehicle screening increased. None of these measures were extraordinary in isolation. Taken together, they marked a transition from monitoring to mitigation. The issue had crossed from public order management into institutional protection. Officials maintained that the situation was contained. From a technical standpoint, this was accurate. Protests were not breaching secure zones. There was no loss of control. But containment does not neutralize perception. It simply limits spread. And perception had already shifted. Public behavior continued to adjust independently. Workers left central areas earlier than usual. Meetings were moved online. Parents altered pickup routes. These decisions were not prompted by alerts or advisories. They were responses to observable cues. Closed shops, altered transport, visible security changes. People reacted to what they could see. This sequence created a feedback loop. As movement reduced, commercial areas hollowed further. As areas hollowed, security posture intensified. Each adjustment reinforced the next. None of this indicated panic. It indicated calculation. By early afternoon, reports emerged of heightened alertness extending beyond the initial districts. Not mass closures, but shortened hours, standby staffing, and quiet instructions issued behind counters. Businesses described the posture as temporary and precautionary. The consistency of that language across sectors suggested coordination, formal or otherwise. The central issue was no longer the protests themselves. It was the pace at which caution was spreading relative to communication. Official statements arrived after behavioral change had already taken place. That inversion weakens reassurance. When explanation follows adjustment, it confirms rather than calms concern. From a governance perspective, this moment exposed a structural constraint. Decision-making flowed upward through approval chains designed for stability, while conditions on the ground evolved minute by minute. This produced delay, not dramatic delay, but enough to matter. Enough for interpretation to replace instruction. The public did not demand clarity loudly. Instead, engagement receded. This is a critical distinction. Voluntary disengagement signals reduced confidence more reliably than visible dissent. It suggests people are no longer waiting to be guided. They are managing risk individually. By the time Westminster responded formally, the narrative space had narrowed. Officials emphasized order, proportionality, and the right to peaceful protest. These points were accurate and necessary, but they arrived after the practical effects had already been felt. What had changed was not the scale of protest activity, but its systemic impact. Retail withdrawal transformed demonstrations from an issue of expression into one of economic and administrative consequence. Once that threshold is crossed, response priorities shift. The state's task became management rather than messaging, stabilization rather than explanation. That approach can restore order temporarily, but it does not address the underlying dynamics driving precautionary behavior. This phase marked the point at which the story moved beyond the streets. The closures had triggered a reassessment of risk across sectors. Transport, commerce, and security were now operating under a shared assumption of sustained tension. The question was no longer whether the situation would escalate. It was whether confidence could be rebuilt before the next adjustment became permanent. By the time official briefings settled into routine language, the most important shift had already occurred. It was not visible on police maps or transport dashboards. It was psychological. Confidence had withdrawn quietly, and that withdrawal carried consequences far beyond the day's events. What unfolded after the closures was not escalation, but normalization. Caution became default behavior. Businesses reopened, but with altered assumptions. Operating hours shortened. Staffing plans included contingency margins. Security briefings became standard rather than exceptional. None of this required public instruction. It spread through professional networks the same way the closures had spread earlier through shared assessment. This is how disruption embeds itself, not through spectacle, but through habit.
抗議活動中、参加者たちは同団体への支持を表明していました。中には、警察が逮捕したとき、私はパレスチナアクションを支持する。
Residents experienced the change as contraction. Fewer spontaneous trips, narrower movement corridors. Public space felt conditional, governed by invisible thresholds rather than open access. The city functioned, but differently. Options reduced. Flexibility narrowed. These adjustments did not feel temporary because no clear endpoint had been communicated. Authorities described the situation as stable. From an operational perspective, that was correct. Protests continued without major incidents. Public order was maintained. Infrastructure remained intact. Yet stability defined only by the absence of collapse misses a critical dimension: participation. Stability without confidence produces compliance, not engagement. One of the clearest indicators appeared in economic behavior. Foot traffic data showed slower recovery than expected. Consumers delayed discretionary activity even after reopening. Retail presence returned unevenly, suggesting selective avoidance rather than generalized fear. These patterns are difficult to reverse once established because they reflect learned caution. The state's response framework emphasized prevention. Barriers were maintained longer than strictly necessary. Policing remained visibly procedural. Decisions prioritized predictability over reassurance. This approach reduces immediate risk, but it also reinforces distance. People felt managed rather than addressed. That distinction matters. When citizens perceive that decisions are being made about them rather than with them, trust does not collapse dramatically. It thins gradually. Engagement fades. Questions go unasked because answers are no longer expected. This thinning was evident in public discourse. Conversations shifted from causes to consequences. Instead of asking why closures happened, people discussed how to avoid inconvenience next time. That shift signals acceptance of disruption as a recurring condition rather than an exception. At an institutional level, the episode exposed a structural imbalance. Communication lagged behind behavior. Official narratives arrived after private adaptation had already occurred. This sequence undermines authority not through contradiction, but through irrelevance. Guidance that follows action confirms that individuals were correct to act independently. Transparency is not measured by volume of information released. It is measured by timing. Miss that window and speculation fills the gap. Not because people seek drama, but because they seek orientation. In the absence of explanation, interpretation becomes the default. The pressures driving this dynamic extend beyond protest activity. Economic strain has reduced tolerance for disruption. Administrative oversight has expanded into daily routines. Enforcement systems operate with increasing visibility. Each factor alone may function as designed. Layered together, they compress social margin. When margin disappears, even minor uncertainty carries weight. The closures did not trigger this condition. They revealed it. They demonstrated how quickly participation can withdraw when systems operate close to capacity. This is why the signal reached Westminster so rapidly. Not because of scale, but because of meaning. Empty stores functioned as a proxy indicator. They signaled that private actors perceived risk earlier than institutions were willing to articulate it. Once that perception spreads, restoring confidence becomes more complex than restoring order. Order can be imposed. Confidence must be rebuilt. The longer-term risk lies in normalization. If precautionary withdrawal becomes routine, it reshapes expectations. People stop anticipating clarity. Businesses stop relying on guidance. Institutions become reactive by default. Each cycle reinforces the next. This does not produce immediate instability. It produces quiet disengagement. Reversing that trajectory requires more than containment. It requires explanation that meets lived experience in real time. It requires acknowledging uncertainty without amplifying it. Most importantly, it requires treating public behavior as rational response rather than anomaly. The events surrounding the closures will fade from headlines. Streets will refill. Shops will resume normal hours. But the memory will persist in subtle ways. In route choices, in scheduling decisions, in the instinct to leave early. Societies remember how uncertainty is handled. This episode was not defined by violence or disorder. It was defined by restraint, by decisions made without announcement, by adjustment without instruction. That restraint exposed the limits of a system optimized for control rather than communication. The question now is whether those limits are addressed or accepted, because pressure does not disappear. It accumulates, and when it returns, people will recall how silence felt the last time. They will act sooner, withdraw faster, trust less. That is the real legacy of this moment. This story is not about 23 stores. It is about how quickly confidence can close its doors and how hard it is to reopen them once they do. If you want to understand what comes next, do not watch for sirens. Watch for silence. Watch for quiet adjustments. Watch for the moments when life recalibrates before anyone explains why. Stay with us. Share this analysis. Subscribe for coverage that follows signals, not headlines. Because the most important shifts rarely announce themselves loudly.